I have to do the Facebook here. We're not going to have a lot of people live, but it's we're now on ETN on all the channels. Okay, so I'm going to have to share this. Okay, just 1 second. We're sharing it now on Travel News Group, and let me share it to eTurboNews. They're going to share it to Hawaii too. Okay, so I'm going to let people in. Okay, good morning, everybody. We're just about to start. I will mute everybody, but then when you're ready to ask question or come in, you can unmute yourself simply before raise your hand. You can virtually raise your hand on the system, and we will give you the microphone when we come to Q&As. So I will mute now everybody. Let me do it one by one so I don't mute Paul and Peter here. Aloha and good morning. My name is Jürgen Steinmetz, and I'm joining you from livestream.travel in Honolulu. And today we're celebrating the opening and launch of the World Tourism Network. World Tourism Network, in case you're not aware, is a new organization. We currently have more than 1,000 members within the travel and tourism industry in 121 countries. This month is our launch month, and we have events like this coming up several times every day. These events are live streamed on the eTurboNews network, on partner medias, and also on our social media network, and will be repeated through all these networks till the end of the month. You can attend any of the events live, or you can watch us on Facebook or watch us later. Simply go to WTN.travel, which stands for World Tourism Network, WTN.travel, and you click on the big event banner or on the launch event link, and you find everything what is coming up. I wanted to point out our official 2 launch events are one December 9th, where we introduce the organization, our chapters, our initiatives, our think tanks. Aviation will have a major part in this as well. And then on December 10th, we have a high-level discussion about the future of travel and tourism and the United Nations World Tourism Organization. And we'll be welcoming Her Excellency Maui from Bahrain. She is currently running for Secretary General for the UNWTO. Without further delay, I wanted to introduce, of course, my partner and co-chair for Tourism Network and also the Travel News Group, Dr. Peter Tarlow. He's joining us from Texas. And our guest today is Paul Hudson. And Paul runs an organization. He's an aviation attorney, from what I understand, and he runs an organization in Washington, D.C. It's called Flyers' Rights. And those that are reading eTurboNews or our aviation, you see his reports. We just had a number of reports in regards to the reintroduction of the Boeing 737 MAX and it'll be a very interesting session. So maybe what we do is I give Peter the microphone to then pass it on to Paul, and at the end there will be a Q&A, and we go from there. How does this sound, Peter?
That sounds great. And first of all, for those of you who are celebrating Thanksgiving, happy post-Thanksgiving and happy holidays coming up. I've been away for the last few days, and I've learned to appreciate airlines. I went to see my grandchildren in Washington, and my wife was afraid to fly, which I think is part of the topic for today. We had to drive from Texas to Washington. So that took 3 days. They were not easy days because so many of the restaurants are closed because of COVID. And one of the things I think we need to talk about today is how the tourism industry is so interconnected with the airline industry. And until that airline industry really comes back and people are comfortable, tourism as a whole is not going to be very successful, especially the long-range tourism. Short range, if you're just a few hours from your home, you probably survive without airlines. But once you get into further distances, then airlines become essential. And they're really, and Paul, I'm going to give you the floor in just a second. But really, when we speak about airline security and safety, I think we have to speak about really 3 areas: kind of getting to and from the airport, the period in the terminal, and then on the airline itself. And most medical people will argue that you're pretty safe once you're on the plane. The questions are how how open are you to a COVID problem when you're in the terminal, when you're picking up your baggage, when you're waiting for a taxi, etc. So that's really not the airline per se, but yet it's part of a travel air experience and how we tend to wrap it all into one. But really, the expert here is Paul. And so, Paul, I'm going to hand the microphone over to you. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what your expertise is. So I think that's a good way to introduce you to the public today.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me. I've been involved with airline passenger rights and interests as an advocate really for about 30 years now. And the organization I presently head is called Flyers' Rights. It was established in 2007. It's the largest airline passenger group in the United States right now, with about 60,000 members. We advocate for the rights and interests of flyers. We are divided really into 2 areas. One is the advocacy, as I mentioned, and we advocate primarily before the U.S. federal government. Secondly, we provide services. We have a website at flyersrights.org. One of the prime features of that is a section called Know Your Rights. It's a Q&A format, and anyone can look up in Q&A format what their rights are in various air travel situations. We also operate a toll-free hotline, 800 Flyers 6, 877 Flyers 6. And we have counselors that will deal with individual problems and give advice. We don't represent people, we're not a law firm, but we do give advice on the kind of problems that come up in air travel. So those, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
So in this year, we have everything is really dominated by COVID and by the MAX. Those 2 issues are kind of like the supernovas that have blanked out everything else. So without any further ado, I'd like to indicate what we think is needed in order to have air travel and therefore tourism recover in these times of COVID, recognizing that everything is very uncertain still. So back in March.
Before you go on, can I just a quick question, and that is the rights of flyers per se with the airlines, or do you also look at their rights as far as safety and security in the terminals? In other words, is it the total experience, or are we focusing in particularly on the flying experience?
No, we're dealing with both airports and airliners.
Okay, that's great to know, because I think that's going to impact the way people hear what you have to say.
So back in March, of course, is when this first became front and center in everyone's mind. Air travel plummeted by up to 95% in the United States. This was totally unprecedented. We set forth a number of things back then that we thought were going to be needed to go forward. And one of them, which was based on surveys of our members as well as from experts, was that in order for people to have confidence in air travel, they need to have, first of all, testing. And as yet, there has been very little, if any, testing in the United States, and very little elsewhere also. Obviously, this has been a challenge, but we're now into this by over 9 months, and we feel that instant testing or very rapid testing by anyone getting on an airplane is going to be needed. Secondly, we need to know that within the envelope of the airport and the airplane, that it's going to be as safe and sanitary as possible. Now, the CDC in the United States has made recommendations for cleaning, for masking, and for social distancing. However, in the United States, those are not mandatory as far as the federal government is concerned. And states and localities have no power or jurisdiction over this. Back in August, we filed what's called a rulemaking petition with the DOT to make these things mandatory. That was ironically rejected at the same day that the president was going to the hospital with COVID. And so we stand by that current situation. Airlines have been doing their best to enforce their own requirements. However, social distancing, both in airports and on airplanes, is very difficult. At the present time, there's only one or two airlines in the United States that keeps the middle seat vacant to allow at least a somewhat social distancing. And the other airlines have pretty much phased that out, and even Delta, which has been the leader in this, is planning to phase out keeping middle seats vacant or doing any kind of social distancing, really.
I think, Paul, we lost you here.
I think we lost Paul here. Paul?
I said I'd like to stop here if you want, and I can take questions on these topics before going forward to the next thing.
Your last part we didn't hear. You disappeared. Maybe you can just, like, the last paragraph, if you might.
So did you get the part where we filed a rulemaking petition to have
No.
Okay.
We heard about Delta Airlines.
So back in August, we filed a rulemaking petition to make the CDC recommendations mandatory as far as the federal government is concerned.
Okay, so I'm negative, okay?
Yes. That was rejected in September, the same time as the president was going to the hospital with COVID. The US DOT takes the position that if at all possible, they don't want to regulate the airlines. They want to keep it as recommendations. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
We can hear you. Yes.
So we're in this situation now where there's all kinds of variation between airlines and airports as to what they're doing or not doing. There's no real enforcement. There really isn't any surveillance either. So this, we feel, is, with the lack of testing, causing a great uncertainty by the traveling public. And until these things are overcome, we think that we're going to be in the same kind of situation. Air travel in the U.S. is now hovering around 50% or less of what it was in 2019. So I'd like to stop here if you have any questions, and then if not, I'll move on.
Yeah,
So-
please just raise your hand and you can easily, we give you the microphone.
Jürgen, we already have somebody asked a question about federal regulations. I assume federal means U.S. federal regulations for airlines to act upon. And I assume that person is referring to issues of COVID, not regulations as far as what type of gas goes into a plane or something like that. So are there any regulations at all dealing with health issues and safety issues for airlines? Paul?
Well, the FAA is the agency, which is a sub-agency of the U.S. Department of Transportation, is the agency that has the sole authority over safety in air travel. They've taken the position that when it comes to health, they don't have anything to do with that. The other agency that deals with regulating air travel is the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, and they are really dealing primarily with terrorist threats.
And so they're basically, has it occurred to TSA that a health crisis could also be interconnected with a terrorism crisis?
I'm not sure what their reasoning is. However, under the Trump administration, they are totally anti-regulation. They came out with their only real regulation in the last couple of years this week, involving animals in the cabins. And to give you an idea of how they approach things, instead of having uniform regulation that says what you can do and what you can't do with animals in the cabin, they basically delegated it to the airlines to decide what they want to do themselves, with some narrow exceptions.
So basically, each airline is a kingdom unto itself.
The airline industry and is really in a unique position. Consumer regulations and safety regulations in every other field are a combination of state, local, as well as federal. But the federal government has preempted the authority to regulate airlines and airports entirely to itself. And it really all concentrated in one agency, the federal DOT. And they have taken the position in the last several years that as much as possible, they should not be regulating, and they should be, if possible, deregulating everything.
Here is Phyllis Stoller was asking a question. Phyllis, do you want to ask it in person? You can just unmute you. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. My question was, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, here's my question. I was on a flight 2 days ago. Gentleman in front of me was not wearing a mask. I asked him to put it on. He did. Later on, he took it off again. I asked him to put it on a second time. He reluctantly did. I reported it to a flight attendant who said I should tell the purser. I told the purser. The purser kind of rolled his eyes. That was the end of that. What do you do at that stage? I also reported his number.
You can file a written report, a complaint with the airline. You can also file a complaint with the US DOT, assuming it's a US regulated flight.
Interesting. Okay.
Our website tells you how to do that online. The main enforcement situation with the airlines is they are, some of them at least, are maintaining no-fly lists for passengers that refuse to wear masks. And there are approximately 1,000 or 2,000 people presently on all those lists. So that is the threat that they have. Airlines are of course, not a law enforcement agency. And some of them have told their flight attendants that they can only go so far with this. For instance, if you don't wear your seatbelt, or if you start smoking or vaping or something on an airline, they will come down on you. And the reason is this is a violation of a federal rule. And if they don't come down on you to stop that behavior, the airline itself can be fined. But under the current situation, there is no enforcement because there is no regulation.
Mhm.
And the airlines, some of them are concerned that they'll be sued if they go too far with this.
I see. Especially because this was in first class.
Their concern is that someone could sue them saying that you're violating their constitutional rights, or that they have a medical condition that would not allow them to wear a mask, and on and on. And no one likes litigation or even the threat of it. So that's unfortunately the situation we're in right now.
Paul, thank you, Phyllis. I want to give you a story I found quite fascinating. It's about a colleague, Peter knows who I'm talking about, who recently went to Turkey, lives in Hawaii. He was able, the only time he was questioned about fever or how he feels was on the flight from Honolulu to Chicago. After Chicago, he was able to get to Turkey. There was no health checks. There was no visa, passport. He spent 2 weeks in Turkey. He flew back from Istanbul to Munich without being asked on Turkish Airlines how he feels. There was no test. In Munich, he was refused to be let into Germany and waited for 5 hours before he was catching a United Airlines flight to San Francisco. Again, no one asking any questions. Flew all the way to San Francisco, went through US Customs and immigration with no problem, no questions asked, and then boarded his flight to Los Angeles. And that's when the issue started, because he needed a COVID test in order to fly on to Honolulu 3 days later. And it was literally impossible to get the result of this test within 3 days. What I'm wondering is, are there no regulations yet to secure, or at least ask passengers if they're aboard a US aircraft, how they feel, how their COVID status is?
Well, what we have now is a checklist questionnaire that you're supposed to check or respond to when you check in for your flight. And there is no actual testing. So, and if you don't check those boxes, then obviously they don't want to let you get checked in. But it's strictly voluntary, and there's no temperature checks. There's no actual in-person Q&A by most airlines that I'm aware of.
So, Paul, would you argue or agree that in reality, even the issue of you have to get a test 72 hours prior leaves an awful lot of space between the time you're tested and the time you're getting on that flight? You could certainly be sick 48 hours prior or 24 hours prior. So it seems to me, until we have rapid testing at the point of actually getting on the plane, the testing's nice, but it's medically, there's a lot, it's a big loophole. The same thing with temperature. That temperature will show if you got the COVID 5 days prior. But if you were infected with COVID 1 day prior, it's not going to impact your temperature. So how do we function legally so that when the person actually is getting on the flight, we know that that person is well? There are some tests that have now been developed, very rapid tests. They're about 70% accurate. The 72-hour test is around 95% accurate. But what is the legal ramifications of this? And, suppose I get on a flight and we discover somebody does have COVID and that infects the entire plane. Do I have any legal recourse afterwards? Or is it just, sorry, you're bad luck?
Well, we're seeing in some of the contracts of carriage that when you buy a ticket, you're actually waiving liability for the airline. Right. That's one thing. I think that in the absence of any U.S. regulation, and the states have, as I say, no real authority over this. Hawaii is really the exception to the rule. No other state has that kind of regime. Is that the travel industry, I think, and airports and the airlines, if they want to get things better without regulation, without the help of the government, the federal government, that is, they need to be more proactive. There's nothing to stop the airlines or airports from doing their own testing. There were suggestions early on that the TSA could do some of the basic testing and the questioning, temperature and so forth. But the federal government has declined to do that. So that's an unfortunate situation where we are. Now, it may change next year when a new administration is expected to come in, but regulation takes a long time. Even on an emergency basis, we're talking about months. And typically, regulations go at snail's pace. The process usually takes several years.
Yeah. And on top of that, the whole COVID situation is changing rapidly. So if it's taking a year to put a regulation in, the regulation may be invalid by the time medically, by the time we get it actually functioning.
That's right. Now, I'd just like to address briefly the situation at airports. I've traveled a fair amount in the last several months, and I've noticed that social distancing is not really possible at the gates. And because the number of flights has been drastically cut back by at least half in order to keep a semblance of the planes being full, the scheduling is often at hub airports in particular. They schedule a lot of flights at the same time,
yes,
at the same series of gates. And I've had the experience of traveling through Charlotte, for instance, which is a hub, as well as a number of other places. And I've never seen such jam ups as they have of people. You'll have hundreds of people waiting to board at virtually the same time, and there's no possibility of social distancing. So another proactive thing I think that should be looked at is to schedule flights so that they are not all at the same time and causing overcrowding at the airport waiting areas.
Which agree that until the situation with social distancing, and I should point out that the science is very clear that the number one impact for keeping down a pandemic is social distancing. More than masks, more than anything else, it's social distancing. And that goes back actually to studies to the 12th century. And until we can figure out a way to create better social distancing, you're going to have a lot of people in the world, not only in this country, but around the world, who are going to be afraid to fly. And if you're sit in a situation like you described in Charlotte Airport, where you have hundreds of people packed together like sardines, then you really question, all the other precautions you took throughout the day prior, how good they are. And even if you've had a test 72 hours prior, you may be becoming infected as you're getting ready to get on a plane. And the point is,
yeah, we see in stores and most places little markers for people to stay 6 feet apart. We see it somewhat at gates, but not where you're waiting to go to a gate. This is something that, once again, could be handled by regulation, but it could also be handled by airports on a proactive basis. I'd like to turn now to something else, and that is the 737 MAX, which we've been very involved in the safety of. Yesterday, we filed an appeal of the ungrounding order that was issued by the FAA on the 18th of last month. And the reason we did that is that the FAA and Boeing, while they promised transparency in ungrounding this plane that has killed 346 people to date, they actually have reneged on that. They're keeping all the data secret as to what the details are of their fix. They're also keeping all their testing data secret, and they're keeping the identity of all the people at Boeing and at the FAA who did the tests and who ruled on the safety. This has caused real alarm in the aviation expert community and by many airline pilots. And we feel that it's necessary for the court to look at this. So I expect in the next few weeks, we'll be filing a motion for an injunction to stop the ungrounding until that appeal is settled. We feel there's good legal grounds for this because it was only 3 years ago in 2017 that the same appeal court reversed a decision by the FAA that was based on secret data. Essentially, the court said that if the data is secret, in other words, the court can't see it, the experts can't see it, it doesn't count. And that, I think, will put a cloud over this whole ungrounding, which is another major reason why people are, I think, unlikely to come back to the planes. If you have an ungrounding with this kind of situation, and the pilots are also complaining about the lack of retraining. They're talking about fly first and train later to a large degree. There are 800 planes that are now on the ground of Maxes, and they could all be in the air in another month or two. And there are about 4,000 on order. So people that are concerned about safety, our surveys indicate that somewhere between 20% and 70% of the people say they will try to avoid the MAX if at all possible. And that is another major detriment to the recovery of air travel and tourism generally.
Is there something you can do? Do you have any rights? For example, suppose I buy a ticket and I then discover that I'm going to be on a 737 and I don't want to go. Do I have any right to ask for my money back or to demand another flight, or am I kind of just stuck?
Well, that's a very good question. Our hotline, the number one question we were getting in 2019 after the second crash was, how do I avoid that bad plane? And some airlines have said that they will let you know what plane you're going to be flying. And if you don't like that plane, they will reschedule you without penalty. But once again, that's totally voluntary with the airlines.
Paul, there is Giso, I probably pronounced his name wrong, Rosala, has been asking something. Giso, do you want to unmute yourself and just ask your question?
Sure, yes. I mean, we are, my question is in regard to the air exchange in airplanes themselves. Yeah, if there were any changes from the technical side, because as we all discuss safety, how we enter the airplane at the gates or in general at airports, we are sitting for a long time in planes, even more than we are at the airports. So how is the safety for air conditioning and air exchange? How did that change in airplanes or airlines maybe? I don't know if any airline thought about it or if they made any changes in that regard.
That's another good question. Airlines have claimed that they have, at least in their larger planes, not regional planes, but larger airliners, in other words, planes that carry more than 100 people, that they have HEPA filters and that those things are supposed to screen out germs. But there's no real enforcement or testing of that. And so once again, we're relying on the airlines as to whether that situation is accurate or not. In general, I think the biggest danger in air travel is on long haul flights, where you're on the plane for 3 hours or more, because you're going to be breathing air that is, even if it's recirculated through filters, you're going to be breathing air that involves breathing by a lot of other people. And masking only goes so far. After a few hours, people tend to lower their masks so they can breathe more easily. And that situation is really, I think, problematic. The few cases that have been proven to have had COVID spread on the plane that I'm aware of all involve long-haul flights.
Can I ask another question? Is there any, if as a passenger, I ask airlines, are they required to provide me those kind of information for how they address the infiltration in the planes or not, if long distance flights are planned?
Could you repeat that question? I'm sure I understood.
If airlines are required to provide passengers those kind of information when I book a flight and let's say I want to fly with Delta, is Delta basically they are responsible for give me the answer? Yeah, if I ask the question how they do the filtration, or is there anything that can prevent them from answering those kind of questions from passengers?
There's no regulation I'm aware of that requires that they answer those questions. Presumably that they will try to give you some information because they want you to buy a ticket, but that's sure. Based on a economic decision.
Yeah.
And Paul, would I be correct in saying, even if they give you the answer, you have no guarantee it's the correct answer?
That's right.
That's right. I mean,
yeah, that's
another.
I can tell you anything you want, but it doesn't mean I'm telling you the truth.
Another thing that you should be aware of with the airline regulation is that not only are they exempt from all state and local regulation, they're also exempt from most all other federal regulation other than DOT. The DOT is considered the lead agency. And if OSHA, if the EPA, if any other federal agency that would normally regulate a company wants to regulate, they need the permission of the DOT, which generally they will not give.
So could we kind of summarize right now where we are by saying that we could call you, we could beg you to try to help us, but there's right now, it's kind of the buyer beware, and prayer may be your number one methodology for protection because the government is doing very little.
Yes, I think that's true. Also, unlike the way it is in the past and the way it is with other in areas, airlines are going to have to compete on safety and on health issues. And to the extent that you have any influence through your individual choice or by recommendations or your clients, airlines can be, I think, influenced by saying, well, if you're not going to allow this kind of safety, then we're going to have to fly with another airline that does. And we saw that a little bit with leaving the middle seat vacant, but now I think most airlines, without pushback, are going back to their initial approach to this, which was, well, we'll lower the fares and we'll waive some fees and we'll, jam the planes up so we can get as much revenue as possible. Now, that didn't work in March and April. Whether it works now, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions for Paul? I don't see. Paul, this was a very interesting session so far, and I think we covered a number of things. Before I let you go, I wanted to recognize a few people that joined us. I wanted to recognize Alexandra. She's joining us from Montenegro, and she's our ambassador for World Tourism Network, and started a local chapter in Montenegro. I also wanted to register HM Hakim. He is joining us from Bangladesh, and we're in the process of setting up a local chapter in Bangladesh with him. And of course, the lady I just talked to, Giso, she was one of our presenter on renewable energy. She lives here in Hawaii. And so I wanted to encourage everyone to get involved with World Tourism Network. Our organization is really an organization what starts on the bottom, and we're not an organization what's regulated from the top. So having local chapters, having local initiatives and discussions is the key point for our approach. We encourage everyone who wanted to start a local chapter just to contact us, and we'd be happy to help you setting this up. And then there are discussions in think tanks, and aviation is one of them. So I wanted to also encourage Paul and his organization, Flyers Rights, to be part of it, so we can continue having this discussion, and at the same time we help with visibility and support to get this message out, not only to our members but beyond. And finally, of course, Peter Tarlo as a co-host and our safety security expert, it would have this was a perfect session for you, Peter, to be involved in. And from my end, thank you very much, and I give the last word to Paul and to Peter, I guess.
Yeah, just before Paul should have the final last word, but Paul, I think you hit something without saying it right on the dot, and that is most of the tourism industry is dependent to a great extent on long-haul tourism. But it seems that long-haul tourism is dependent, of course, on the airline industry. And without better regulations and better laws protecting the client, the customer, we're going to, as people, be afraid to take long-haul flights. And if that's true, that's going to have an incredible impact on the rebirth or the renaissance of the tourism industry. And so what you're doing is really essential, and I want to really beg you to do everything you can to put pressure on governments to make sure that the visitor, the traveler, who especially wants to go to Europe or to the Middle East or Asia, wherever it happens to be across the world, really feels safe on those airlines. And that's, without that, the tourism industry will never recover. So I think we all owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude for everything that you're doing. Paul?
Well, thank you. And I can only say that this is something that's going to require from the bottom up, I think, solutions. And I would recommend that your listeners and others join Flyers Rights. We have a section on petitions, and we think that with the new administration coming in, we will hopefully see a better regulatory framework in the future.
Well, we want to thank you for everything that you're doing. And Jürgen, I think we have had an absolutely wonderful session. So I think it's time.
Also, I forgot to mention, Peter, of course, this session will be repeated, and it'll be archived in about 2 hours. If you go to WTN.travel and click on the event page, you see it, but you also see it under worldexpo.travel. If you go to worldexpo.travel, you will also see an archive. So if you want to listen to it again and also get the contact information for Paul, we're also going to put this on our website, and you can always listen to the session again. We also allow downloading these videos, so they're not meant to have a copyright value, so you can spread it around on your own network. Well, from my end, that's it, and I can only say,
take care. Travel safely.
Thanks, Paul, again.